For those of you who have just joined us, this is the Tech Stage, and my name's Aidan McCullen. I am the host of the Innovation Show, and every week I get the amazing opportunity to interview authors. So I read the book each week, interview the author, and then learn from it. So I feel it's like learning with witnesses. And our next guest is in that very fashion. So we're going to actually broadcast live this next fireside chat. And the way I want to introduce it is as follows. After the Cold War, the American War College introduced an acronym called VUCA. And VUCA stands for Volatility, Uncertainty, Complexity, and Ambiguity. And that term really came to prominence after COVID. Everybody was saying it's VUCA times, it's VUCA out there, because it was trying to describe this world that we were now living in that was so complex and so connected. But that term got disrupted last year. And there's a new term in town, and that term is called BANI. And BANI stands for brittleness, anxiety, non-linearity, and incomprehensibility. And our next guest has written a book about leading in a non-linear world, where it's very, very difficult to make decisions when most metrics in an organization are lagging. They're historic metrics. He is a management consultant for the last 30 years. He's worked with organizations like Coca-Cola and Google and Warner Music, but to name but a few. He's also co-author with Tony Schwartz of the New York Times best-selling book, The Way We're Working Isn't Working, which we'll all agree with in many, many ways. Welcome to the stage, straight off his keynote from the personal growth stage, Jean Gomes. We're just going to sit here. Imagine there's a fire here for us. I don't think we need it with the heat. So I'd love you guys as well to engage. If you have any questions as we're going, jump in as we're going. So put your hand up. The colleague is there with the microphone. She can come to you with the microphone. So please jump in. But we're going to start off, John, with, firstly, I think the concept of non-linearity, because this speaks to so many people who are starting a career, trying to understand, how do I even start? What do I study? Where do I go with all this? What do I do? And a lot of people are suffering from anxiety because of that.
Yeah. Well, I think a starting point is an acceptance of reality, because there's part of us that loves change and wants to stay in our lane or in our comfort zone and so on. And, there are little enclaves of certainty that you can probably go and find. But the reality is, and the IMF have been tracking this for a long period of time, is that uncertainty in economic and political and social terms has been on the rise since the 1940s. And since 2016, it's gone into hyperdrive. And AI has taken that up a notch. And therefore, if we don't embrace the reality that we're in, that's going to be, that's going to leave us feeling kind of quite isolated a lot of the time. So I think, that's the starting point, really. Accept the fact that we are living in a non-linear world.
In the book, you talk about 4 mindsets. So before we even explore those 4 mindsets, this is kind of, nothing's happening here, nothing to see here. That's
on your rider, isn't it?
He's pickpocketing me. What is the term mindset? What does mindset actually mean? Because a lot of people don't know what that means. It's thrown around in books. It's thrown around in leadership talks.
I'd love to ask this audience. I've asked the question about 25,000 people over the last decade. And the reality is that most of us don't know what we mean by the term. It's the secret sauce that people in business describe. Those individuals, regardless of intellect and intelligence, are able to do things that other people can't do, entrepreneurs and transformational leaders and so on, without ever quite knowing what it is. And if you look at the research and you look at the papers and the books and the countless articles and HBR and so on, you'll see the same thing, which is people describe the behaviors of people with a mindset and the mental models and frameworks they hold, the what, and they never tell you how. There's very little information. So that's like saying, here's a clock, it tells time, without telling you how it tells time. So the problem with mindset is that when you ask people, they don't really know. And they give you 2 broad definitions. One is mindset as an attitude or belief around something, or something quite different, actually. Something is a mental model or an idea that you hold to make sense of the world. And those are parts of what a mindset is. But we've come to looking at this from a neuroscience point of view, that your mindset is the most fundamental way in which you make sense of the world. And it's comprised of 3 kind of big clusters of sense making, which is how you feel, think, and see. How you feel physically and emotionally, how you think in terms of the predicting brain constantly running on a series of assumptions actually being your reality, and then the mental frameworks or lenses that you hold up to the world that allow you to see things, disregard things, marginalize things, pay attention to things. Those three things are constantly working together and interplay to make sense of what you know in a situation. When you start to know that and start to know the underlying mechanisms that form that, you can move from trying to adopt a mindset, trying to kind of behave like other people do, to build a mindset that will create a more flexible and powerful mind for the road ahead.
One of the things you mentioned there was, say, for example, if you think about it, since World War II, we've had a pretty stable time on the planet. We've had no war, Ukraine apart recently, but we've had a pretty steady ride, including organizations. So the past of an organization, I build a competitive advantage, I build a moat around that, I market the heck out of it, and then I sell as much as I can of my product. That's all gone now, right?
Yeah.
So I was reading about this amazing term. There's a term called stresswood, if anybody's heard of it. Outside my house, I have a bunch of trees I planted, bay leaves trees, and they were getting hammered by the wind. They were getting thrown all around the wind, and I was like kind of going, ooh, I don't know if they're going to survive. So then I studied about it, and I actually learned that there's a term called stresswood, and when a tree gets hammered by the wind, it actually builds this resilience within it, and its wood is called stresswood. And I thought that's exactly what this period of relative peace has done for many, many people, is that we haven't got that resilience to be able to manage the change, because human beings have been magnificent innovators since time immemorial. And at one stage there was 20,000 mating pairs left. We were an endangered species, and we've come from there to our position of dominance now. And that's something that's a real difficulty to reintroduce that willingly. So people are doing cold showers, they're doing fasting and those kind of things to do it. But from a mental perspective, it's very difficult.
Well, that's a great point, because if you think about what propels organizations forward is a set of assumptions about what is going to create value. So you have your business model about how you create, capture and deliver value. And what you were saying earlier on about leading and lagging indicators, we don't care about leading indicators when things are going well. Because there's an underlying assumption, it's called the baseline assumption in most organizations that are successful, that what was valuable yesterday will be valuable in the future. And that is the dominant mental model, the shared collective belief and mindset that most organizations have. And that is no longer going to be true for many organizations. We need to see the complete destruction of vast, parts of the S&P 500 over the last 2 decades. I think 70% of them have gone. And that's happening right now everywhere. So we need a different way of thinking about that. And one of the mindsets that we talk about in the book, as a kind of corporate strategic mindset, is the fundamental way of thinking about things is that we have a past-present mindset, this idea of the baseline assumption. What we need is a future-now mindset. We need to be thinking about delivering performance and growth simultaneously, which very few people are capable of doing.
Yeah, and how do they build that muscle? Because I know a lot of people are struggling out there, and I don't mean just newer, younger generations. I mean a lot of people in their 50s and their 60s, people who have got to the top of the ladder and now realize, oh, I don't have the skills. And it's kind of like linked to your previous best-selling book, The Way We're Working is Not Working. That goes for the individual as well, the way I'm showing up to work, my mindset for work, because I'm used to doing things that were pretty standard. It was more exploitation of my advantage. Now it's about exploration. I don't have those skills anymore. So how do you bring that into an organization?
Yeah, well, this is a great question, because I think when you get to, I'm 60, and when, I look at, myself and, my peer group, a lot of people are in a very defensive position at the moment, particularly what's happened in the last year about technology. And that's the wrong place to start. They have wisdom, they have pattern recognition, they have self-knowledge if they tap into it. So I think mindset is the place where everybody needs to focus first, because without that, you become inherently defensive in your outlook to things. So if you are in, mid to late career, the most important thing is to tune into not, defending your value, is actually to tap into feeling and accepting your vulnerability in the face of change, because that's the the precursor to real growth and development, because you have a lot to give. What people want from us is not knowledge and ideas. They want wisdom.
That's a huge problem. If you think about the way the workplace has evolved, it's based on war and it's based on religion, the hierarchy, the triangle.
Yeah.
So a leader at the top who doesn't want to know the names of the people in the middle or the bottom of the organization, because you could be sending them to death, to certain death. And that still remains. That echo of the past is still there.
Yeah.
And that piece is also, well, I'm a leader who's got to the top of the organization by acting like an alpha, male or female, and I've had to show stony face, I've had to be stern with my people, and if I show any kind of vulnerability, I'm vulnerable because maybe a board of directors or maybe some of my colleagues kind of go, John's lost, he's gone soft, he's giving people Fridays off, he's doing a 4-day work week. How do you do that? Because you work with organizations from a leadership coaching perspective as well. Is that where it begins?
Well, I think it begins in two places. One is forget the outside world. You have to accept in yourself that feeling of vulnerability. You can't make any change in things. And then I think it's about moving past it being a zero-sum game between being strong and confident and, certain about things that you fundamentally feel out of your depth in, or being vulnerable, weak, turning up crying at things and so on. It's not about that. It's not about that polarization. It's about embracing things, about recognizing the determination to succeed, to achieve, to discover, and at the same time to recognize what you don't know, what you're missing, what you've not paid attention to, what's out there that is alien to you, and holding the tension between those two things. You can be brave and fearful at the same time. That
tension you mentioned, the tension of opposites of the future and the present, so exploration of the future and exploitation of the present. I often think about this, and I'll ask the question to our audience. Imagine you are the boss of your organization, or you walk into the boss's office, and the boss is sitting there with their boots up, looking out the window, and you're like going, what the heck is she doing, right? So you're absolutely flabbergasted by this. And the reason I say that is that should happen on a regular basis. The way we know that from neuroscience, and we'll get into neuroscience in a moment, that's in your book, we know that taking breaks and actually looking out the window and breathing exercises and meditation throughout the workday are actually boost your productivity. So you'll do better work when you're doing that work. But if you did that, and I know this, we have Google HQ and LinkedIn HQ in Dublin and Ireland, where I'm from, and very few people use those booths, the meditation booths, because you don't want to be seen in it, because then all of a sudden it's like slacker.
Yeah.
That's a huge problem.
Yeah. Well, then we need to get into a conversation about what is the prevailing mindset that makes that happen. The prevailing mindset is, whether Protestant work ethic, whatever origin it has, is a sacrifice model. And the frame, the way in which we see things is you have to be all in to succeed. And the underlying assumption that comes along that, the think part of it, is I can't get what I need. I can't meet my needs. To be all in means I have to sacrifice my health, my feelings, my emotional state, my family, and so on. And the feel part of it is I just have to suppress the emotions. And the primary emotion is resentment. I can have a brilliant job, I can be in a great organization, but I coach lots of CEOs and senior leaders. And that resentment is on full display a lot of the time about their lives that they have. And what that results in is a problem of paying it forward, because if I can't get what I need, you can't get what you need. And so that's what perpetuates this. So Google and other organizations that embrace these kind of well-being initiatives, they don't allow it to happen in the organization because of the sacrifice model that work. What we need is a sufficiency mindset. And it starts with a needs-based way of looking at the world. What do I need? What do I need physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, socially, and so on? And the assumption that goes alongside that is I can perform and get what I need. So what Aidan's talking about in terms of rest and renewal being an intrinsic part of performance is true. We need to see the fact that those two things feed one another, and that negative emotions are not actually something that are being done to us. They're not a hardwired response to people triggering us or being rude to us. They are a way in which we make sense of our core needs. So whenever, the latest neuroscience shows that when we experience a negative emotion, it's not a hardwired response. It's a construction, something we construct to make sense of our needs not being met. And when we understand that, we can bust this whole thing around feeling resentment. And actually, that drives social innovation. Because at the moment, what you've got, and why a lot of these things around, hybrid workplace arguments and so on, is because the sacrifice model is basically being used to try and figure out how to make it work. And it'll never work, because it fundamentally doesn't want it. It wants control. It wants everybody to be all in, sacrifice everything, and stuff down the feelings of resentment with buying yourself a Porsche, drinking too much whiskey, and whatever doom scrolling you do. That's it.
The resentment thing is a huge thing. I see it a lot with women leaders who get to the top of the organization. There's two ways they react. Sometimes they pull the ladder up after them, and they're resentful of somebody who has a balanced life below them. So there's that resentment there as well. And I had a lady on the show, brilliant book called Bias Interrupted, and her book is, Joan C. Williams is the author. And she talked about this bias called Suck It Up Buttercup. And it was like, I went through it, so you can go through it too. And it's kind of like, you see it oftentimes with parents, kind of going, my kids have it too soft, I'll kick a chair in front of them and they might trip over and then they'll have a bit of resilience. But you see in organizations all the time where they, instead of being a leader that paves the way and smooths the way for people, oftentimes leaders actually don't want to do that because they had to work really hard to battle through the old system instead of actually paving the way for the new system. Yeah,
well, they're creating resistance for change in the very people so that they depend upon for the future. And we're seeing the great resignation in large organizations of that disjuncture between values. But it's actually, it's mindsets that are really operating there, that newer generations, or younger generations, are actually much more attuned to their needs. They may not have the language to describe it, but they know that they want to meet those needs. They know they want to be healthy. They know they want to do things they care about. And they can look at those leaders and go, no, you've just sacrificed everything for money, or you've sacrificed everything for progress, and that doesn't turn me on. So if my generation doesn't really recognize that and start to reinvent itself, it's going to create a massive gap.
There's a lot of entrepreneurs, judging from their questions from the last session with Justin, there's a lot of entrepreneurs with us, and with entrepreneurship there's oftentimes a guilt associated with any spare moment I have, I need to be putting into my business, etc. And then there's a culture that's hopefully had its day of work porn, it's called. It's like, oh, I'm working all day, I'm working till all the hours, I sleep under my desk, etc. Now, as an entrepreneur, I work for myself, and I have young children, I made a different decision, but I did do a decade of work that much. And it dawned on me one day that I may have all those things I want. I may be providing this great life for my family, but when I get there and they're ready for me, then I kind of go, yeah, we made it. Look, we've got this beautiful house. We've got everything. All great holidays. They'll kind of go, who are you? And there'll be a resentment there within the family as well. And I'm saying that to some of the younger entrepreneurs now, that because this is in your book about how do you interrupt that early and rewire that way of working before it becomes a habit, because it does become a habit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you're smart and you've worked very hard to get into a great university, and then you've got a brilliant idea for a startup, and you've got all this energy as well and potential, and you can see things, what you may be lacking is imagination thrown in a different direction. So you may be envisaging this idea, and you'll be convincing yourself, because you've pitched it 1,000 times to investors and colleagues and friends and so on, that you can change the world. But what about your world? How much imagination have you invested in thinking about what happens when this is realized or not? Because be careful what you wish for is what I would say in this. And I think when I'm coaching particularly young entrepreneurs and scale-ups and so on, yes, there is this whole thing around managing well-being in the moment and making sure that you don't take on too many costs. But what would your 90-year-old self say about the life you're living at the moment and the life that you're going to create? You're going to have the relationships with the people and things that matter outside of work. Are you going to have looked after yourself in a way that, there's more to it. When you've made your money, when you've, established your sense of worth around this great startup, what's left after that? And there's just a lot of evidence to suggest that people aren't happy by that once they've finished that. And then the only way in which they can fuel that one dimension of life is keep on doing it again and again and again to regain. It's like an addiction, and the only way you can, feed any addiction is to recognize you get diminishing returns from it. So you just keep upping what you put into it, which means the other dimensions of your life potentially get smaller and smaller. And if you have kids and then you kind of wake up and they're 20 or 30 and you have no relationship with them or with your partner, is that the life you really want? So that kind of forces us to think about creating more of a balanced scorecard, which is difficult, undoubtedly, when you're doing something as demanding. But I also think about treating our lives as a series of sprints, where we fully invest, deep investment in things, followed by periods of intentional recovery. And some of those recovery is short, it's 2-3 minutes during the day, some of it's longer. But if you can't do that, your brain is always in one place. If it's always in one place, so is your life.
One of the things that changed my whole mindset about this, and I wanted to share with our audience, was there's a quote by Dalai Lama, and he said that one of the great paradoxes of life is that mankind spends all their time sacrificing their health for money, and then when they have money, spend all the money on their health because they've sacrificed it for so long. So it's not just family, and there is this huge thing about you might get the gold watch, equivalent of, really you're CEO of an organization, you're driven by that, you sacrifice your family, but also the health aspect of this, There was on the personal growth stage, some of you were there yesterday, there was a couple of practitioners talking about meditation, etc. And there was a few of our audience really frustrated by the fact that they couldn't meditate. And it is such a valuable skill. Again, you touch on this in the book, of developing those skill sets early so that they actually can manage your health throughout life, through those difficult moments, and building up essentially a mental stress wood over time.
Yeah. So the way I've approached this is slightly different access point. So the kind of majority of the industry is kind of saying to you, do this because it's good for you. It leads to these benefits. And then people try and do it, particularly people who are time poor, are completely, like their brain is frazzled most of the time because of the endeavor they put itself through. And then they try it and they're tired and wired, and guess what? It doesn't work. And they give up and they go, it didn't work. I mean, I have so many people say to me, I tried it, it doesn't work, I don't like it, it's the opposite of what I'm doing, and so on. So it's kind of like asking someone to smile when they're angry, smile or laugh, and it's impossible. You just want to punch them in the face. So the thing around this is that you need to find a way into it, and there's two ways into it that I kind of routinely find helpful. One is understand what it does to you in a mindset point of view. And what it does is it strengthens something called metacognition, your ability to think about thinking. And this ability is what allows you to bust assumptions, see the perspectives of other people, to stand back and have a kind of inner coach to see what you're missing, to be able to find ways forward in really tricky, complex situations and so on. And mindfulness and meditation are shown within a very short period of time, 2 weeks, to increase this capacity. And it's what I see in entrepreneurs world over as a form of competitive advantage, to see what other people are not seeing, and particularly in themselves. And the way to do it, because we were given this challenge by Olympic coaches to find ways of getting meditation and mindfulness into the practices, they just didn't have time for people to do it. And so we just got them to do mindful activities. So when you're pouring water into a kettle, when you're mowing the lawn, when you're brushing your teeth, just to focus on that experience intently, the grasp of the toothbrush, the experience of that. And that actually changes your brain state and brain structures within a couple of weeks, just doing that routinely, 5 or 6 minutes a day. So you can find a way into it. You don't have to be the big, sitting with your arms folded and cross-legged and so on the mountaintop. You can actually do it in very, very practical ways. But understanding that it is building a part of your brain that will make you able to see things that other people can't.
I'm trying to get my kids into doing this, so they're 9 and 13, and my younger boy is just kind of getting into sport now. And I've been telling them about how it's a competitive advantage to be able to have metacognition, to be able to catch yourself thinking.
Yeah.
And he's like going, how does that work with soccer? And my reference point is rugby, and the best team arguably in the world for rugby is the All Blacks, the New Zealand All Blacks. And they've all been coached in managing emotions on the pitch, because it can cost you a game if you give away a penalty. So they all have these little triggers to do. Some will stamp their feet, some will look up at the flag, all these different things as little reminders. And that's what I love about when you mentioned that about the toothbrush and he's ironing, something that very few people enjoy. But I've actually rewired my brain to kind of go, be present when I'm ironing, and those kind of things. But those little triggers I find in the book are so important. I wanted to bring it back to the book and give our audience some core takeaways, because there's 4 distinct mindsets you talk about in the book. And I'd love you to, at a high level, maybe mention each of those. Yeah. And then we'll dive into a little bit more about how do you, as an entrepreneur, as an individual, how do you build your own mindset?
Thank you. Yeah. So the 4 mindsets all kind of start with this idea of what is the feel, think, and see model around particular challenges facing us. So the first one is called More Human. And this is based on a huge amount of research and practice, probably about 60,000 people worldwide, about how to help people improve their well-being, particularly in the face of rising demand and uncertainty. And one of the kind of ideas in here is that the whole habits industry, trying to teach people how to build habits, doesn't really work. It works probably for about 10-15% of people. Because it's predicated on the idea that you, like in the laboratory, that you can manage cue, routine, reward, that whole process. It sits underneath that, and you can build automaticity. The trouble is that most behaviors that we want are highly complex. So they are not simple. They're not easy to build in that way. So if you think about going to the gym routinely is about 30 or 40 separate activities. But more importantly than that, your feelings, your mental state influence whether you're going to do that much, much more than the habits. So you could have built a habit, but then in the middle of being on the running machine, you start thinking about the day ahead and you think, I'm going to see Aidan later on, that's going to be awful. And you get triggered and you just walk off, you get changed. And
that wouldn't happen.
No, it wouldn't happen. Yeah. But so what we are thinking here is that you have to create the general circumstances for a mindset to give you what you want. And the starting point here is to recognize that your physical state is the foundation on which is all this built, and building an awareness about your needs at a physical, emotional, and mental level. And so in the book we describe various techniques that sort of don't focus on the behavior, they focus on the mindset and building the structures in your brain that help you to do that. And one of those structures is the insular cortex, because you notice in people who have got huge resilience in the face of challenge, their insular cortex is bigger than others. And you can build your insular cortex through very simple processes. And one that I'll just quickly talk about is a body scan. So the first thing that happens to you when you wake up in the morning is you have a few seconds where you're not feeling and thinking. You're just experiencing the rawest form of consciousness during the day. And that is incredibly valuable if you tap into it. So the body scan is literally, before you start feeling and thinking, you get that surge of adrenaline that comes with it. You tap into your body and you just scan your body from the top of your head, linger on your forehead, your eyes, your throat, chest, and so on. And you just tap into how you're feeling objectively. You don't try and judge it. You just go, how am I feeling? And what that does is a number of things. It strengthens the connection between the heart and the vagus nerve and the insular cortex, which is really powerful. But it also helps you with something that's really useful, which is make a separation between your body budget and your feelings, your emotions. So if I wake up and my body budget is poor, I've drunk too many glasses of wine the night before, or I've not been eating or exercising, or I've had a particularly stressful week beforehand, my body budget will be in deficit. Get into the shower, start thinking about the day ahead, and the emotions that get constructed around that are resentment, negativity, stress, this is going to be a hard meeting, your journey to work is going to be hell, and so on. And I construct a day where I'm trading away my power, this is not going to be great. If I catch that and go, my body budget isn't good, I can start to reinterpret my emotions and go, I just need to be easier on myself, I need to not react, and it really fundamentally changes your mindset and approach to it.
You got to rewire that body budget for tomorrow after the wrap party at 9 p.m. tonight. A lot of people are going to be taking your advice on that. So that's
one.
That's one bucket. The human.
Yeah.
Be more human. Okay.
Yeah.
What's next?
The second one is future now, which is I mentioned earlier on, which is this tendency of individuals and organizations to build a past-present organization based on the incredible endeavors of the past and transport that forward. The future now mindset is fundamentally different in what it's doing is it's holding attention between what the future needs and what we're doing today and not making a trade-off between those things, running them in parallel, which very, very few organizations are good at doing. Because what they end up doing, what leaders end up doing, is pushing the future down the organization. And then it becomes a competing commitment. What generally happens is the focus of most leaders in organizations is 95% of the present, which means they've got a tiny future. And what innovation efforts they do give to the rest of the organization get pushed down, and when they rise up, they don't have enough headspace, their head is not in the game. So we need them to think about building a kind of 30-70 focus so that they can actually be in the game, they have enough understanding of what's going on. And then the other part of this mindset, very briefly, is about their inability of most organizations and leaders to know the difference between risk and uncertainty. They clump it all together. So when you are thinking about making bets on the future, are you making bets on probabilistic reality of something that's going to happen, or on an uncertain situation? And that gives you a very different way to make decisions and make investments in the future. And we don't see very many organizations and leaders knowing the difference between those two things. It was really the root of the 2008 financial crisis. But still today they don't. So I think that's the second one. Yeah. The third one kind of flows out that, which is the experimental mindset. And this is, again, something that we think is really important, because every book that we read on entrepreneurs and experiments, this whole playbook about test and learn, is very clear as a series of behaviors and tools and mental frameworks. But it says little or nothing about the mindset, about how people feel, think, and see, around how they truly deal with fear and uncertainty, their emotional responses to things. So when they're doing assumption busting or what if sessions or whatever, they do not have the skills and tools to know how to deal with that, and it often marginalizes what they can achieve, the progress they can make, the ownership and accountability for the outcomes they're creating, and so on. And then the final one is called the open mindset, which basically says, to your point about the fact that we've created these hierarchical organizations, actually, increasingly we need to build open organizations where, right from an individual mindset, being open to the possibility of things that we currently don't know about being possible, to how teams operate. Open teams. Most teams are closed units. They don't allow people in and out. Teams don't work together. They are fighting against each other. They're not teams of teams working together. So how do you do that? And then how do you create organizations with more porous boundaries that don't allow the kind of politics from the top-down dynamic to become so defining to how people work? So those are the four mindsets.
Beautiful, beautiful. I'm not sure, are you guys losing John every so often with his mic? Yeah? Maybe if we could get a handheld, it might help. His battery might be going in his mic pack from the guys down the back. So, last question, John, and then I'm going to open up to the floor, is how do we build these mindsets? So you've touched on some of them. You've touched on them being more human, the resilience, the insular cortex, building the mindfulness, the ironing your shirt or brushing your teeth. What else can we do?
Well, the neuroscientist Stephen Fleming, who's the world's leading metacognition scientist, sorry, I can feel myself dripping out here. He said that the number one starting point to building a mindset is self-awareness. It's the capacity to pay attention to how you're feeling. So, just thinking about your mindset.
And we'll turn that one off, maybe.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. So just thinking about your mindset starts the process of building it, but it's pulling apart three forms of awareness. At a very high level, it's what frame am I holding up to the situation? What lens? Because a lens is something that allows you to pay attention to information, to disregard it, to marginalize it, to ignore it. And often, particularly in startups, you can get frame fixedness, where people are holding up the same lens because they've got a role in the organization or they've got a skill set, or a sense of identity. And actually we need to be able to change those because every frame comes with a series of assumptions and feelings in regard to a situation that you find yourself in. So being able to swap out the frames, to be able to get better at understanding the assumptions that come with those frames and being able to challenge them, and then recognize that the feelings, negative feelings that we often have are just error signals telling us a core need is not being met in us. And when we actually understand that, then we can get to first principle problem solving so much more rapidly.
I just want to let you know I have a copy of John's book up for grabs on the Innovation Show Substack. So if you just go to substack.com, you'll find the Innovation Show newsletter, and I have a copy of the great book up for grabs for anybody who's interested. Just drop your name into the hat. John, I want to open up to the audience here. Anybody have any questions? I think I see a couple of hands. Yeah. Have you got another mic to give these guys? No? Okay, I'll do it, John. I'll do it. Yeah. Okay. I'll bring it back to John. Yeah. You okay? Yeah. Sorry. There you go.
Thank you. First of all, it was really interesting to listen to your insights and your information. I have a question. It seems that the whole awareness around building a mindset is relatively new and fresh, and it's shaping younger generations even more. What would be a specific method to go bottom up as within a team towards management if you're on the lower hierarchy scale?
That's a great question. So I think the most powerful way is not to communicate, is to do it. And teams that adopt certain practices around this demonstrate extraordinary abilities that other teams don't. So one very simple thing that some organizations are experimenting, but we kind of introduced it in Google and eBay about 15 years ago, is check-in. And the check-in is a really simple thing, which is asking people, how are you feeling? And giving them a chance to think about how they're feeling and then say something about how they're feeling physically, emotionally, mentally, without judgment. And what that does instantaneously is it switches on parts of our brain that call the mirror cells that allow you, mirror neurons allow you to kind of become more empathetic, to shift your attention from internally to externally. It lights up the hippocampus, which means you retain information more readily, and so on. So immediately, with just one question, you've got a group of people who are much more alert and present. And the second thing it does is it flags what's really happening in the room, what everybody knows but nobody's talking about, that's dictating and defining what's possible. And stopping leaders, particularly the person that's kind of running the meeting, from making assumptions about why people are showing up the way they're showing up. Because often when people talk about how they're feeling, you realize, oh, I thought you just didn't like what I was saying, or I thought, you weren't, supporting me. And then you find out, no, their kid's sick, or they've just got out of a really difficult meeting. And all of a sudden, your threat response lowers and the meeting becomes more productive. So that one practice, if you do it regularly, and when you invite other teams into it, spreads like wildfire if you do it well, because what it does is it builds a collective mindset and creates a mini culture within a team where they're able to get things done. And the argument that's always presented is we don't have time for this shit. We've got things to do. We can't talk about how we're feeling. Unfortunately, how you feel profoundly influences what you're going to think and do. So if you're feeling angry, if you're feeling resentment, you're feeling judged, you're feeling this, that, and the other, well, you're suboptimal, you're not going to do very much. So 5 minutes of going around and having this question and then making people feel, it also increases massively psychological safety, which is another topic entirely. But the idea that we're actually all free to be heard, to listen, to learn, to contribute, to challenge the status quo, significantly increases when people can talk about how they feel. So that would be my one kind of suggestion for you.
One of the greatest organizational renewals I've seen of recent times is Microsoft. And they instilled this mindset called growth mindset, which is the work of Carol Dweck, a Stanford professor. And one of the ways they did it was with a check-in. So at the start of every meeting in the organization, people sat down together and kind of going, tell me about how one of your members of your team instilled the growth mindset. And then they started to go, oh, this is actually important because now it's being measured. And that part of measurement and rewarding of the changes, the behavioral change, is so important but so overlooked. Any more questions out there? Oh, here we go. That's easy, man. Thanks for making it easy.
No worries. Hi, that was a great question. I would like to just plug into that one. Coming into like a huge corporation, being kind of young with 27, I can see a general disparity in the mindset between, like, let's say the senior management, which I've been there for like 30 years or something, and the young enthusiastic coming ups who will want to change the world and starting with a company and so on. And I can often see a general, not maybe ignorance or like stubbornness to open up to accepting new upcoming mindsets of the young population and realizing the problems that they have and the different upbringing that they had as children and young adults. How would you, if you were younger again, try to open up this topic to the senior management and maybe change it how it works?
Oh my goodness, this is the $64,000 question. It's the one question and the one challenge that I face on an almost daily basis. In fact, I just had this conversation with the HRD for a big global company, 120,000 people, with a new CEO coming in who's exactly in the headspace that you were talking about. And there is no easy answer, because if you think about it, that person's identity, their sense of worth, their sense of value is so profoundly tied up with the sacrifice they've made. The fact that with that sacrifice comes a whole bunch of assumptions that are deeply, deeply rooted in the stories they tell about themselves every day, which is, I did this. I did it because of what I had to do to make it work. They don't necessarily recognize that that sacrifice has been at the cost of many things to them. They don't necessarily recognize, for example, that their wife was form of their competitive advantage. The sacrifices she made, the fact that every time I turned up, after a long haul flight, I was rude and unpresent with them and my kids. I'm doing this for you, my dear. No, you're not, because we don't want this. So that is very difficult. But what I do see is happening. So I can't answer your question in the sense of here's a playbook to go and talk to the CEO or the senior managers about this. It's recognizing in part what is they're not getting. And where I've found really big progress is when people can start to see that they can get what they need and be successful at the same time, you break some of these assumptions. And I think that's the answer, really, is to try and social innovation is brought about busting assumptions about what was previously regarded as impossible, infeasible, undesirable, and so on. And so the question that, I think is, like, how can we do both? How can we have really high levels of performance and allow people to manage their well-being, to make really, good contribution, to be able to challenge the status quo? And it's that both question, I think, is missing in a lot of these things. It's either this or it's that. It's either you get to contribute or you don't. It's like, no, I want you to lead and I want to be able to challenge it as well. So how can we do that?
To link your questions together, because a similar thing happens in innovation. How do I make my organization more innovative? And a key thing to remember here is it's easier to sell success than it is to sell an idea. So if you can create a pocket of excellence and then point and go, look at those guys, they're doing a really great job and they're more productive and they're working 4 days a week. And then people will kind of go, oh, now I get it, because there's some type of metric and it's a real thing rather than a PowerPoint slide. What if? Very hard to sell what if. It's easier to sell success. So that's a way to join our two worlds together. Yes?
Thank you very much for your great talk. Just to follow up on the gentleman's question, there seems to be a big gap between generations, obviously in the mindset, and apparently that is the biggest challenge of Gen Z. They fight with seeing us, older generations, so different and not willing to integrate. So is there a formula that can come to a common denominator of a mindset that might work for all generations and for the benefit of all, as opposed to us old people being, trying to offer our skills where we should offer our wisdom, and them having so much energy but not having what we have. So what would be your formula? Thank you.
You're not old. What you say, us old people? What are you bringing us into it for? Only joking.
I think I'm just about crossing into the old thing, so you're right.
You're okay.
So the question is, how do we start to think about, like having 4, maybe 5 generations all working together, and the fact that, each generation now seems to be, each generational gap seems to be getting faster and faster. I think there's something really simple and profound that's at work here that is worth paying attention to, which we often miss. And it works for the DEI agenda as much as anything else, which is that when we're with people who are not like us, we experience something. And that's something that's not like us could be lots of things. It could be ethnicity, it could be culture, it could be ideas, it could be intelligence, it could be language. It doesn't matter. But what it presents in us is something that often we deny. And when we deny it, we act out. That something is vulnerability. Those generations might be different, but what they're actually experiencing when they're working with one another is feeling vulnerable on both sides. The experienced people, wisdom, power, status, all the things that they did to get there, are feeling vulnerable with the youth, the energy, the new thinking, the language that they use, with the ideas that they understand that they have no understanding of. They're feeling vulnerable. And the young people are feeling vulnerable about the power, status, the control, and they're also feeling other things which they can't talk about, like disgust. They're feeling disgust at older people. I don't want to look like that. And, this isn't something that is often talked about, but those feelings of vulnerability, disgust and disdain and resentment and so on are actually what's standing in the way of creating an inclusive mindset. So when you turn on the vulnerability and accept you're feeling vulnerable, which is very countercultural in organizations, then you can start to recognize how you create safety. And when you create safety, then you can turn on empathy. Those 3 mechanisms start to build an inclusive mindset. That's what we need to teach people. Then we can work together. But it has to start with recognizing feelings of vulnerability in the eyes of people who are different from us. And if we don't do that, a reverse cycle takes place, which is we start becoming judgmental. We start questioning people's value. And then we use our intelligence to create arguments to justify our feelings of feeling vulnerability. So this idea will never work. You don't know what you're talking about. You're just a lazy, millennial. You're just a inflexible, irrational boomer, whatever it is. And we go through that cycle of polarization. And that is, a reality that polarization around the generations is leading to politics in organizations.
Brilliant, John. Is it okay if anybody wants to grab you for more questions, they can grab, John will be around there. So I highly recommend the book and John's previous book as well, and the podcast as well. Very successful podcast going for a long time. Author of Leading in a Non-Linear World, Jean Gomes. Thanks for joining us. Cheers, man.
Thank you very much, everybody.
I'll take that just in case.